back to World Crisis Radio. Now, as promised, we want to go to Great Britain and get a line on the new regime there, the new Tory Lib-Lab coalition that has now taken over. And so we want to get the view from two of the leading activists in the country. That would be Tony Gosling and Martin Summers, generally based in the Bristol area, I think, still. So we want to welcome them and let them take it away. Just, guys, remember, U.S. audience not too knowledgeable about these things, so give it to us straight. We got about 10 minutes. Go ahead.
Well, I think the main thing to say, Webster, is Tony Gosling here, that there was no, as people know, there wasn't any kind of definitive result in the British general election, so we have three parties kind of having to make alliances in order to make things work over here. I think there's been a lot of spin talked about this Liberal Democrat Conservative alliance, but I'm not entirely convinced by it. I think one minutiae was that actually Gordon Brown resigned and David Cameron accepted the Prime Ministership from the Queen before the meeting at which the Liberal Democrat MPs, along with Nick Clegg, actually decided to have a pact with the Conservatives. So obviously there's a bit of a sort of attempt there to bounce these MPs into accepting this agreement that Clegg has made with David Cameron. The other big shock for me, really, is to see Kenneth Clarke in such a powerful position. Now, he's very unpopular in many parts of the Conservative Party because he's so vehemently pro-Europe, whereas the natural Conservative line is generally anti-Europe. And so this is a little bit shocking. The other thing, of course, is that for many of your listeners who will know the way the Bilderberg conferences operate, I mean, these people are very, very much in the driving seat when it comes to financial policy, particularly here in the Western world. And it's fair to say, if people have ever been to my website, which is bilderberg.org, that the people that go to these conferences constitute really control of most of the money in the Western world via the central banks, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the European Central Bank, and the Federal Reserve. So what you can see here is that Ken Clarke is a Bilderberger. He's not just any old Bilderberger. He sits there with David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger on the steering committee of Bilderberg, and he has just been given a real plum job here in David Cameron's new cabinet, which is a joint role of Justice Secretary with the recently created Justice Department and also Lord Chancellor. Now, I can remember in my O-level politics at school here, you know, when I was about 15, 16, being told about the role of Lord Chancellor as being quite a sort of weird, anomalous role where you've got one foot in the government and one in the judiciary. Now, of course, the separation of powers means that really there shouldn't really be such a role where the government and the judiciary is embodied in one single person. But Kenneth Clarke has managed to grab that role, which means he's involved in appointing judges. He has a great deal of power when it comes to contentious legal cases, and he is very, very good at spinning himself as a sort of jazz buff. And so he is actually the main Bilderberg person for the UK. He's the main number one Bilderberger. And what with the meeting coming up in June in Spain, the Bilderberg meeting, it's really interesting to see. I mean, he's not going to want to miss that because as many people that analyse these things, like myself, will conclude, is that actually the Bilderberg conference represents a more powerful international force than even national governments do because of the financial clout that it has.
How about this guy Osborne? Now, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, he's going to be the main austerity fiend and austerity ghoul. And actually, before we leave Clarke also goes back to Thatcher, right? He was in the Thatcher regime.
He rose to power under Margaret Thatcher very, very fast. He was involved in many controversies, including the Iraqi supergun case, the Matrix Churchill case, where Clarke famously at the DTI used these something called a public interest immunity certificate to stop government evidence actually going to the trial. That was pretty unprecedented at the time. And then he became health secretary. His first public appearance was in a Formula One racing car advertising cigarettes on a motor racing circuit, and then he was chancellor for many years. But I mean, his key role, I don't think, has been anything other than as a Bilderberger. He's a very great friend of the IMF and the World Bank and people like that. You mentioned George Osborne. He's also been along to these Bilderberg meetings. He's sort of Kenneth Clarke has George Osborne sort of under his wing, so to speak. And he's in a very difficult situation because there's quite a progressive economic spokesman for the Liberal Democrat Party. That's Vince Cable, is having to work with George Osborne, who really is much more of a right-wing, let's cut everything type. Now, I'd also point out that both Cameron and Osborne were part of this Oxford Bullingdon Club, which is a sort of club for toffs at Oxford. And it may seem innocent to many people, but I mean, I can tell you as an Oxford resident from years ago myself that this club is infamous around the city for being totally lawless. They like getting drunk, they like throwing glasses around, smashing windows, and goodness knows what else they get up to. And it really seems to embed in these people's minds that they're totally above the law. These are not the right people to be running the country. There's no doubt in my mind about that.
Can you repeat the name of that club, the Oxford Club?
It's the Bullingdon Club, B-U-L-L-I-N-G, Bullingdon Club, right. And it's based, I think, at Brasenose College. Anyway, I don't know if you want to have a chat to Martin before we finish about the economic situation.
Let me just ask you, in terms of Cable and the Lib Labs, did the Liberal Democrats have the Robin Hood tax in their manifesto? Did the Robin Hood tax get anywhere in the campaign?
I'm afraid not, Webster. This is Martin Summers here speaking. I'm afraid what... hi there. I'm afraid what happened is I'm a Labour activist, as you know. Obviously, we didn't win, but all the party leaders of the main parties here were in favour of spending cuts. The Conservatives were saying spending cuts now. The Liberals were saying next year, and the Labour Party was saying next year. Now, I'm a Keynesian, and I don't believe in spending cuts now or in the future. We need to have a New Deal, as we saw in the US in the 30s, and that means actually expanding government expenditure on things that we need. And all of the political parties here have been bought into this idea that we've got to cut the deficit. And because we're in a capitalist civilization, many ordinary people have bought into this idea as well. We've got a crisis, we've got to tighten our belts. You know and I know what's wrong with that attitude. That is not the way to deal with an economic crisis. It's just totally wrong. And I think that this alliance between the Liberals are a left party. Yeah, so an alliance between them and the Republicans, which is effectively what it is not stable. And we are outside the government now, and I would hope to see the trade unions here and the labour movement and the wider social movement put up a hell of a fight to stop spending cuts, for example, on schools, hospitals, and all adult education, all of these things that people actually need in a depression and a recession. This is all going to go by the board if we let it. But I don't think the population here have really taken on board the implications of this. And when the cuts start coming down the line, I think we're going to break this coalition and they're not going to stay in power for 5 years.
All right. Now, it looks like the one thing that they agree on is savage austerity, drastic austerity, balance the budget on the backs of working people.
Yeah, that's right. But the opposition to that, the solidest opposition to that comes from the trade unions here. The trade unions actually fund the Labour Party, and they're not very happy with hearing that stuff coming from their top people. Obviously, there's a kind of attempt to find the middle ground, but I don't see how you can find the middle ground. You're either cutting public expenditure or you're not. Right. There is no middle ground. And they are definitely intending to cut public expenditure, and I've seen reports done by right-wing economists in the City of London saying that if there are attempts to cut public expenditure, then the economy will tank. I mean, they know this. They know this because that's exactly what will happen. And the same thing would happen in the US. Now, obviously, you can't run massive deficits forever, but that means you've got to raise taxes on the wealthy classes who profited from the bubble. All of this malinvestment.
And you've also got to force the central bank to issue 0% credit for development. Just a question about the Labour Party. This woman who is now head of the Labour Party, what's with her?
Well, she's not going to stand for the leadership. She's a fairly moderate centrist kind of character. Think Nancy Pelosi, something like that. She's not a bad person. She's not a good person. She's just, a nothing sort of person. But she's not going to stand for the leadership.
Okay, placeholder. The music tells us we're out of time, Martin. Thank you to Tony and Martin, and we'll try to get you guys back soon to get an update about the evolution of the crisis. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for having us on, Webster. We'll speak to you soon.
Bye-bye. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio.